The public was supposed to swallow a wholesome family reunion narrative. We were meant to buy this picture-perfect tale of a quiet homecoming, a touching, symbolic moment where a doting grandfather finally gets to embrace his estranged grandchildren. But behind that heavily manicured PR illusion, a freezing cold operation was playing out, something highly calculated, entirely deliberate, and designed to morph a supposed moment of deep family healing into an absolute royal lockdown. This entire grand scheme didn't even get 24 hours to breathe before it leaked. It wasn't just subtly whispered about, it was completely exposed. Suddenly, every single micro detail of this proposed visit, every staged appearance, and every planned movement was being aggressively dissected online like forensic evidence in a high-stakes trial. And surprise, surprise, the internet wasn't feeling sympathetic. The backlash was sharp, immediate, and utterly brutal. Everyday people didn't see a broken family trying to heal old wounds. They saw a cynical PR strategy. They saw leverage. They saw innocent children being weaponized as pawns in a messy pressure play against the ultimate crown. Once that toxic perception locked itself in, the game completely shifted. Inside a tense room thousands of miles away, the vibe had instantly turned icy. The conversation wasn't emotional anymore. It was purely operational. Cold, hard, and calculated. This trip was no longer about family ties. It was strictly about demands, optics, and absolute control. Because without one non-negotiable element, the entire house of cards collapsed, state-level security. It wasn't optional, and it wasn't up for debate. So when that security request came back officially denied, it didn't just complicate the trip, it obliterated it. Let that sink in for a minute. A royal-adjacent visit completely stripped of state protection, meaning zero armed escorts and absolutely no guaranteed coverage the second they step outside palace gates. Every single movement would suddenly depend entirely on external discretion. That is not just a mild inconvenience, that is total exposure. In this volatile environment, exposure meant extreme vulnerability. Not just physically, but symbolically. It meant walking straight into a country where you no longer controlled the narrative. The counter-move wasn't gradual, it was immediate and surgical. The family would stay put. The kids would not return. The dream image of a grand royal reconciliation vanished overnight. Just like that, the highly anticipated reunion morphed into a pathetic solo mission. One lonely man, one quiet arrival, completely stripped of his family shield and his emotional centerpiece. Just a bare, unprotected presence entering a country that had already decided exactly how it felt about him. But while that panic damage control was being executed abroad, a far more decisive chess move was happening inside the ancient stone walls of Windsor. It wasn't emotional, and it wasn't reactive, it was purely strategic. Because for Prince William, this drama was no longer about petty family tension. This was about the very structure of the British monarchy being tested publicly, visibly, and dangerously. Inside a closed room, miles away from standard cameras and polite statements, hard data was being studied, not feelings. They watched public sentiment rapidly shifting, hostility rising, and toxic patterns forming. The final conclusion was crystal clear. This wasn't a misunderstanding. It was a direct, calculated challenge, a blatant attempt to blur the lines between sacred royal duty and private influence, which the future king decided could absolutely not be tolerated. So, the crown's response wasn't some loud, trashy public spat. It wasn't overtly dramatic. It was something far more dangerous than that. It was a regime of silent enforcement. Zero shared appearances, zero joint engagements, and zero overlapping schedules. They wouldn't even grant the illusion of family unity in a single camera frame. It was a total operational separation meticulously designed to send one unmistakable, freezing message without uttering a single word. There are two distinct sides now, and they will never mix. And here's where this whole saga gets even more unsettling. This icy blockade wasn't even about petty punishment. A simple punishment would have been much easier to explain away. This was about cold, hard containment, a controlled, clinical isolation so unbelievably precise that it completely stripped away not just access, but basic visibility. If a visit was going to happen, it would exist entirely in a vacuum. There would be absolutely no royal backing and no institutional alignment. It would just be a solitary figure moving awkwardly through a powerful system that had already tightly closed its ranks. Meanwhile, inside another room, one much quieter and infinitely heavier, the entire situation looked completely different. Because for King Charles, this drama wasn't some grand political strategy. This was about time, limited, rapidly slipping away, and impossible to ignore. This was a fragile grandfather staring down the fading possibility of ever seeing his grandchildren again, watching that dream evaporate in real time. He wasn't sitting there obsessing over PR optics. He wasn't overthinking royal precedent. He was thinking about precious moments, missed ones, final ones, the exact kind you never get back. And in that heavy, emotional space, the very idea of a compromise didn't feel like a weak surrender. It felt completely necessary, entirely human. But that is exactly where the catastrophic collision happened. It wasn't just a basic feud between brothers, or even a typical fallout between a father and son. It was a brutal war between two completely different definitions of what the British monarchy should actually be. One side was driven by legacy and raw emotion, while the other was fueled strictly by rigid structure and long-term survival. Because the second a desperate request came in to somehow bend the rules and make this visit work, the response wasn't hesitation. It was immediate, firm, unyielding resistance, and the justification behind it was absolutely brutal in its clarity. If the rules bend even once under outside pressure, they don't just snap back into place. They break permanently. And if that ever happens, the entire royal system becomes negotiable, weak, and completely exposed to anyone else willing to apply that exact same leverage in the future. So, a hard line was drawn, not publicly, not emotionally, but absolutely. There would be zero security concessions, zero institutional backing, and absolutely no reopening of doors that had already been slammed shut. And in that exact moment, something massive shifted that can never be reversed. Because this wasn't just a block family reunion anymore. This was a definitive declaration, a loud signal that the future of the monarchy will absolutely not be shaped by emotion, even if it means ruthlessly sacrificing something deeply personal to protect something far larger. And as the deafening silence settled between those heavy decisions, one haunting question lingered in the background, growing louder with every single passing hour. If a high-stakes reunion this significant could be shut down so completely and so decisively, what else has already been decided behind those closed palace doors that the public hasn't even seen yet? What happened next didn't explode into massive headlines. It didn't need to, because the most devastating moves in this game are never loud. They are administrative, dead quiet, and completely irreversible. Somewhere deep inside the cold machinery of the British state, behind tightly closed doors and buried beneath layers of ancient protocol, a decision was finalized that changed absolutely everything without a single emotional word attached to it. There was no debate and zero compromise, just a freezing, structured conclusion that stripped the entire situation down to one undeniable reality. There would be no state protection, no special exceptions, and absolutely no bending of the system for anyone, regardless of their bloodline. And that is exactly where the grand illusion finally collapsed. Because up until that exact moment, there was still a lingering belief, maybe even an arrogant expectation, that media pressure could force a movement, that the emotional weight of grandchildren, of family, and of royal legacy might tip the balance. But instead, the exact opposite happened. The system didn't bend. It hardened completely. And when that brutal ruling reached its destination, the impact wasn't just logistical. It was deeply psychological. Because suddenly, this drama wasn't about a complicated visit anymore. It was about isolation, total, undeniable isolation. It was a harsh realization that the institution wasn't merely reacting anymore. It was actively enforcing. And enforcement doesn't negotiate. It doesn't care about PR narratives. It simply draws a boundary and holds it, no matter what stands on the other side. Inside that exact moment, the strategy that had been so carefully built began to completely unravel. Every calculated step, every anticipated reaction, and every expectation of how far the other side would go collapsed under one brutal miscalculation. They thought the system would hesitate. It didn't, not even for a split second. And as that realization settled in, the response became immediate. There was absolutely no time to recalibrate, and no space to rebuild the narrative. The only option left was a retreat, but not a quiet one. It had to be a controlled exit, a total reframing, because if the story couldn't be won on arrival, it had to be completely redirected before arrival even happened. So, the decision was made with clinical precision. The family would not come. The children would not be seen. The image of a united return would be entirely erased before it could be used against them. But even that panic move carried its own massive weight, because pulling back didn't just remove them from a situation. It amplified the divide. It turned their absence into a loud statement. It made the distance visible in a way presence never could. And suddenly, the entire narrative shifted again, but this time into something far more dangerous. A standoff where neither side needed to speak for the message to be fully understood. Meanwhile, something else was happening. Something quieter, but just as revealing. Because when one major door closed, another opened, not within the same walls, and not under the same authority, but within a completely different lineage, a different loyalty, one that didn't operate under the same rules or limitations. And that shift changed the dynamic in a way no one publicly acknowledged, but everyone internally understood. Because now, the situation wasn't just about access to the monarchy. It was about where protection, allegiance, and identity truly came from. And when that alternative support system activated, it sent a signal that cut deeper than any official statement ever could. It said if one side enforces distance, the other will tightly close ranks. But even that didn't move the core decision, because back in Windsor, the stance remained exactly the same, unchanged, unmoved, almost unervingly calm in its absolute certainty. There was no reaction, no adjustment, just total continuation. Because from that perspective, everything unfolding externally, every shift, every countermove, was already fully accounted for, expected, and completely predictable. And that is what makes this entire situation so incredibly unsettling. It is not the conflict itself, but the absolute control, the sense that every single possible outcome had already been mapped out, every pressure point already understood, and every reaction already anticipated. Which raises a far more uncomfortable question. Was this drama ever actually about stopping a family reunion? Or was it purely about proving that it could be stopped at all? Because in the end, the result wasn't just a canceled visit. It was something far more permanent. It was a line drawn so clearly that crossing it now would require much more than a negotiation. It would require dismantling the very structure that put it there in the first place. And as the dust settled, as the silence returned, one haunting image remained. An empty room where a historic reunion was supposed to happen. It was a moment that never arrived in a system that proved, without ever raising its voice, that it no longer answers to emotion, only to itself. And the most unsettling part? This doesn't feel like an ending at all. It feels like the beginning of something much colder, something far more controlled, and something the public is only just starting to notice.